Confederate General Patrick Cleburne wanted to utilize slaves in the early part of the war, but was turned down by the Confederate Congress. Not until March of 1864 did President Jefferson Davis, along with Robert E. Lee, convince the Confederate Congress to officially muster in black troops. These troops would never see battle. Lee would surrender at Appomattox in April of 1865. No other event in our history has defined the American Constitution or our government than the American Civil War. With the American Revolution, we the people declared that all free-thinking men shall be self-governed. With the spirit of 1776, we give definition to a people who agreed to self-government. Out of the ashes of the American Civil War arose the encompassment of a strong, centered government. We now brought definition to our government, but not without a tremendous cost to our nation. Well over 600,000 Americans of North and South gave their last measure for the birth of this new nation.
Bodyguards of our masters surged through the wall between the states, and we have been to all the reunions, and they have treated us just the same as any other soldier. I'm Marmaduke, Joe Shelby, bodyguard. Done everything they told me to do. So one day, General Marmaduke told me to go and get some chickens. I told him I didn't know what's going on. He started and got his gun, looked like them red chaps on there. Told me, yes, sir, I'll go right now. Well, you ought to know how old I am? I'll be 81 years old the first day in August. Dan with me.
There are, at the present time, many colored men in the Confederate Army, doing duties not only as cooks, servants, and laborers, but as real soldiers, having muskets on their shoulders and bullets in their pockets, ready to shoot down loyal troops and do all that soldiers may do to destroy the federal government and build up that of traitors and rebels.
On February 4, 1861, in Montgomery, Alabama, a new country was born, the Confederate States of America. The 6 southern states that had seceded from the United States of America had sent delegates to form the provisional government. On February 9, Jefferson Davis was elected president. When the Union moves to recapture a military base inside one of the seceded states, 5 additional states joined the Confederacy.
The Civil War began with Beauregard and Johnson victory at Manassas. And it seems that when we study the American Civil War, we read about Manassas, we read about Antietam, the bloodiest day, We read about Gettysburg and that three-day battle. We sometimes we talk a little more. If you're a little more, we know about the Wilderness Campaign and the Siege of Petersburg. Finally, Richmond Falls, although the federal troops are actually at Petersburg, chasing Lee's army retreating toward Dansville. And then Lee surrenders at Appomattox, and you're really starting to wonder, because it sounds like the South is doing just fine for a couple years. They don't do so well at Gettysburg, and a couple years later they surrender. That is perhaps 1/4 of the story.
Well, everybody knows what the immediate causes were. You know, the election of Lincoln, secession of the South, firing on Fort Sumter. But there were a number of underlying fundamental causes that led to the war between the states, war for Southern independence. Now, one fundamental underlying cause was slavery. No question about it. But let me point out that most of the great controversies on the national level concerning slavery did not concern slavery in Tennessee and Alabama and Mississippi. It concerned slavery in the territories. That's what Missouri Compromise was all about.
Sticks up.
Determined to preserve the Union, Abraham Lincoln vowed to do whatever was necessary. 25 days after becoming President of the United States, he declared war on the Confederacy. In response, the South prepared to defend its newly formed country. Those who would fight against the Union cause were not only white farmers and aristocrats, but also slaves and freedmen of color.
With regard to the fact that many blacks tended to stay on as the Civil War was being fought, even though they had opportunities to just walk away from many of the plantations because the men were off fighting the war, there were some economic reasons. One, they did have a place to stay and they had a roof over their head. And there was that great fear of the unknown. What happens once I leave here? I mean, there was not anyone out there offering jobs for ex-slaves or freed slaves or runaway slaves.
The question is often raised, why would a black fight for the Confederacy? And my answer is for the same reason that a white Southern would fight for the Confederacy. You see, the war started with Abraham Lincoln decided against the advice of his advisors to invade the South. And when he did invade the South, the first thing the Yankees did was rape the black women. Then they raped the black missy girls, those approaching young womanhood. Then they went and got drunk before they could rape the white women. Well, if that was enough to make the white Southerner angry enough to go fight, why couldn't the black Southerner be just as angry and go fight?
So in many cases, slaves and blacks would hide the women, their mistresses, and to keep them away from the Yankee soldiers who were getting drunk and unrowdy and just looting and pillaging. It really was hard back home for the women and for the people that were left there. There was only old men and women back home. If you could fight, if you were able, you went to war.
Well, I think that most people, when they hear that there were blacks who fought in the Confederacy, they are outraged because they think that these fighters were forced to fight. In some instances, they probably were. It's very hard for people today to accept the fact that a black could volunteer for Confederate service because he felt some kind of patriotism towards the South, that he felt loyalty towards a master, or that he wanted to prove to the establishment that he was deserving of eventually receiving his freedom. What many Americans forget is that there were 5,000 black soldiers who fought with George Washington during the Revolutionary War. And of course, in 1812, Andrew Jackson, who praised the blacks in his service profusely, also knew that those blacks were taking a risk fighting for the United States government. So if blacks can fight for George Washington, it's hard for me to reject the idea that their grandsons could not have fought for Robert E. Lee. And of course, remember, they had practical considerations. Many of them, they only knew the South. And many of the blacks who were in the Confederate forces, most of the blacks were more useful to the Confederate Army or to the Confederate government as civilians as opposed to being soldiers or sailors. Many of these blacks were taking a chance of saying, look, I'm going to show you that I'm a patriot, and I hope to be rewarded as a consequence of it. These are very practical considerations. I think the problem that we have today is most Americans have a difficult time accepting the past because we read into the past the prejudices of the present. The moment you do that, you're not dealing with history. I mean, history, I've often said to my students, is like taking a bath in muddy water. You're never going to be completely clean. And you have to see the past as the past was, not the way we wish it was.
Many slaves throughout the South felt an allegiance to their slave owners, particularly in the instance where they were not beaten every day. Many slaves came to accept slavery as their fate, as a way of life.
It is a factor that has been made up note of that very few Southerners actually owned slaves. Most Southerners did not.
People are doing what they have to do. They are sometimes doing what they want to do, and they are doing what they were forced to do. Many of those who are working in the Confederacy are slaves who were laborers. Many others who are in the Confederacy are there with their slaveholders who are also their relatives. Their Union Army may be very far away, and it will be completely out of the question for them to be able to safely escape to it.
So they lived a comparative in a comparative status. The slaves at the plantation down the road were beaten regularly and what have you. They were not adventuresome in many instances to the extent that they were willing to run away and face the unknowns of what was waiting for them 100 miles away or 50 miles away. And then family liaisons suggested that many slaves did not leave. But I think that there are numerous psychological studies taking place whereas individuals become to a certain extent dependent on their oppressors. And I would have to think that this was probably, not being a psychologist of course, but I would have to think that this is probably the motivation for forest slaves remaining both during the war and even after the war, as has been indicated by others, until their deaths. You have to keep in mind that many slaves, the lion's share of slaves, learned no real marketable skills beyond that of field work. You had a few slaves who became craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, what have you. The lion's share of slaves were field hands. They had little opportunity after the war was over with to fend for themselves economically. They owned no land. Many left plantations and then after a brief period of time returned to those same plantations to work on a sharecropper basis. So I think we have to investigate and to take a good look at all of the kinds of dynamics that were taking place that would make an individual remain with his oppressor. How many people are there in the United States now who work on jobs they don't like?
One moment, gentlemen. Uncle Plays.
Yes, sir.
Did I hear you call Uncle Plays?
Yes, sir, Judge. Uncle Pleasant Woodford.
Come here. Come here.
Yes.
Uncle Plays Woodford. Are you the boy that brought Bainbridge Corwin's body back from Chickamauga?
Oh, yes, sir, Judge. You remember. I brought him all the way back. And these two arms. Don't you remember?
Yes, I do.
The number of African Americans that took up arms against the North remains a question. In the 19th century, Southern laws allowed any white man to let any African American to be treated as a white. for all legal purposes. So it was perfectly all right for a master to send a slave in his place in the army while he stayed home. Body servants were the sole responsibility of individual white soldiers that took them to war. Because of this, they never served as official army personnel and never were really counted in any government documents. There were reports of 3,000 of them in the Army of Northern Virginia in 1862, while the 8th Texas Cavalry boasted having 500 body servants.
From the beginning, even Union observers noted that 5 to 10% of the Confederates under arms were blacks. These would be wagon drivers, cooks, body servants, and so forth. When Lee's army was crossing through Maryland on the way to Antietam, a Union observer made this notation that the Confederate armies were 5 to 10% black and they were carrying weapons. So these were integrated just as was Southern society.
Wednesday, September the 10th, 1862. At 4 o'clock this morning, the rebel army began to move from our town. Jackson's force taking the advance. The movement continued until 8 o'clock p.m., occupying 16 hours. The most liberal calculation could not give them more than 64,000 men. Over 3,000 Negroes must be included in the number. They had arms, rifles, muskets, sabers, bowie knives, dirks, etc. They were supplied in many instances with knapsacks, haversacks, canteens, etc. And they were manifestly an integral portion of the Southern Confederacy Army. They were riding on horses and mules, driving wagons, riding on caissons and ambulances with the staff of generals, and promiscuously mixed up with all the rebel horde.
The black troops in the South were not segregated like they were in the Union Army. They were treated just like the men and the white soldiers in Confederate uniform. They received the same pay. They received the same gratuity that the white soldiers did. They fought for the same reasons. They were protecting their Southland. They were being invaded by a Union Army.
Since the interest in black service in the Confederate armies is relatively new, and because Confederate records are not as accurate as the Union records, we probably will never know the exact number of troops in the Confederate Army, and therefore the exact number of blacks. However, a number of prominent historians are studying it, and I've seen estimates ranging from 60,000 to 120. The truth, if it is ever known, will probably be somewhere in between maybe 80, 90, pushing 100,000, but we may never know the exact number of either one.
I do know from things that I've read that there were some black body servants who went with whites when they went off to war, and there were some things that slaves did, but as far as a formal introduction of blacks into the cause of the Confederacy, you know, I haven't come across that. There were some things that were done as far as infrastructure and the like, and people providing services to, you know, those who, quote unquote, owned them as slaves. I would estimate 5 to 10% of the Confederate Army were made up of African Americans. There were 1 million to 1.5 million men under arms, and the estimate of 5 to 10% would put it at 100,000 to 150,000 blacks that directly served in the Confederate Army. Of course, everybody is home growing food and running the gun factories and producing the ammunition and the gunpowder and so forth, which was largely done by slaves during the war. Those are people who are all contributing to the war effort, too.
The body servants were one of the most loyal groups of African Americans in the Confederacy. They often formed a special bond with the men and women of the house, sharing the ties of home and family. While attending to their elder master's needs, they also saw to the needs of the young children with an affectionate love, while helping to raise them to adulthood. As Southern men were called to war, their faithful body servants remained by their side. This unique relationship between black and white men gave shape to an even stronger bond between them during the war.
There's an example of many brave black African Americans who fought during the Civil War on both sides. For example, Cedric Searcy, who fought for the Confederacy. He was born in 1846 in Talbotton, Georgia. He was born a slave, and he came up in the household of Dr. John Searcy. Dr. John Searcy had two sons, and their two sons joined up with the 46th Georgia in 1862, and Searcy, he went with them as a body servant. Okay, they fought in the Battle of Chickamauga, Missionary Ridge, on Kennesaw Mountain. Both of Dr. Searcy's sons died, and Mr. Searcy, he stayed with the 46th Georgia up until the surrender of General Johnston.
And yes, they had blacks that fought for the Confederacy. I don't find that a real contradiction. Again, people are familiar, regardless of how bad conditions are, we have a way of psychologically adjusting to them. Some people can't, some people can. Also, when the slaves were freed, oftentimes they didn't go anywhere.
We were sort of brought up together, Master Will and I. He got to be a fine and reckless sort of gentleman. Then the war came. I went with Master Wills. Nothing could stop him, and I knew he would need me. Sam Newsom, Tennessee.
Now, I do know that blacks served the Confederate Army in many capacities, building fortifications and so forth. And many blacks actually accompanied Confederate units in the field.
Some slaves were taken from the fields and hired out by their masters to non-slave holding families or soldiers. While body servants were responsible for one soldier, oftentimes they served up to 8 soldiers at a time. It was only an exceptional few wealthy Confederates who could afford to have more than one slave with them. The bulk of those who had servants were privates. In fact, roughly 60 to 70% of body servants were with captains or lower-ranked men.
Because I think it tells the complete story. I think we learn a great deal from their participation about slavery and about the impact that this war had on all Americans. I certainly don't cast aspersions on their character or even on their intentions, for naturally, in hindsight, and I think if I was living at the time, I certainly would have been fighting on the side of the Union. But I think it gives us a complete story and certainly sheds light on the war and the totality of the impact that the war had on America.
Body servants ranged in age from 14 to 60, serving as cooks, foragers, laborers, and teamsters. They also took care of the needed armory in combat, shouldering extra guns and gunpowder, and on many occasions took up a gun in the heat of battle and fought alongside of the masters. After the various battles, bodied servants were expected to take the wounded or the dead back home, even if the Confederates were miles behind the Union lines, no matter how long it took.
Master Wills was killed at Chickamauga. I brought his body home. I smuggled him by the pickets, hired a wagon, and got him to Chattanooga. From there, I brought him on home. Sam Newsom, 51st Infantry, Tennessee Volunteers.
We give you as little food as possible, no education, huh? In fact, we want you docile, we measure the a good slave by his ability to predict his behavior by doing what we say. Some folks don't know, had never had a concept of war. They just grabbed a gun. They probably took you at 17, 18, 19 like the U.S. Army does, huh? Okay? and give you a rifle, say, your gang against that gang, huh? And as motivation, we give you little trophies, huh? And again, these people might have been living better than ever fighting the Union Army.
It's January the 1st, 1863, and we're going to be just down the road here, about 40 miles, at Murfreesboro. The battle there started the day before. The Confederates have pushed the Union Army back. Another 150, 200 yards, they'll sever the Union line of retreat into Nashville. So early on the morning of January the 1st, 1863, the 8th Tennessee Volunteer Infantry comes out of some woods and begins to advance across a cotton field. Leading the advance is the color bearer, a man named George Dance. George Dance is an African American. Think about it. January the 1st, the day the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect, a Confederate corporal carrying the flag of his country leads a charge against the Union Army, and that Confederate corporal is black. He was promoted for bravery that day, by the way. He was promoted to color sergeant. I have pictures of the reunion of the United Confederate Veterans in Lynchburg, Tennessee in the years after the war, and there, proudly taking his place among the surviving veterans, is George Dance, color sergeant, 8th Tennessee. After the Confederate Army fell back from Murfreesboro to Tullahoma, the commander of that army, General Braxton Bragg, issued a general order, order number 38. That order says all Army employees, black as well as white, will receive the same rations, medical care, and food. These men didn't carry weapons, but they obviously were considered valuable to the military effort. I don't know how many of them there were. I don't know the names of any of them, but we know from the available official records they were there.
The youngsters in the Civil War also played a part, though you hear most about the men who were off fighting. A lot of the boys joined as musicians, fifers, drummers, as such to get in. Many of the sons went along with their, particularly in the South, went with their father or their relatives into battle and became ammunition bearers or water bearers, water boys, canteen bearers.
All the fifers and musicians in the Confederate Army were black and were paid equally in the Confederate Army as with white musicians. Whereas in the Union Army, they tried to pay blacks a different pay rate than they paid white soldiers.
One of the most famous generals in the Confederate Army was Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest. He had 45 slaves whom he took from his plantation to serve with him during his command.
Probably one of the most elite units in the Confederate military was Nathan Bedford Forrest Cavalry, and specifically one of his units, his own escort company. These were essentially the Green Berets of the Confederate cavalry. They were handpicked, the best troops. They were put into this escort company, and when the fighting really got down to the wire, Forrest would put in his escort company to basically carry the day. Of these handpicked men, about 20% of them were black cavalrymen. That these were some of the bravest, some of the best shots, some of the just most fearsome men that the Confederate cavalry had, and these black and white troopers formed this elite group of Forrest escort.
Forrest was a major slave trader prior to the Civil War. His attitude towards black was one, at best, of paternalism. He viewed blacks as property. After the war, he viewed blacks as having a particular place in society.
And after Reconstruction was over, he actually worked through the Democratic Party to bring black voters in this area into the fold of the Democratic Party. So if anything, he was a man of his times in this area of the country.
My great-grandfather, as a Union soldier here on April 12, 1864, faced black Confederate soldiers under the direction of General Nathan Bedford Forrest. He was also wounded here, and I don't know whether he was wounded by a black Confederate soldier or a white Confederate soldier, but I know he was wounded and he was captured here, and from April 12, 1864 until October the 31st, 1865, that is when he returned back to his unit.
I think fundamentally Forrest was a pragmatist. While slavery was a legal institution, he was willing to use the system and benefit from the system. When the war was over, he recognized slavery was through, that it was never coming back, and he went about trying to rebuild his fortune. Forrest addressed some of the black citizens of Memphis after the war and told them that the war was over and that he would advise them to do the same thing that he advised the men who fought with him, and that was to become good citizens and to vote. He said, "I will not tell you how to vote, but vote." He was a pragmatist. People don't realize that, and too infrequently give him that credit when it comes to issues particularly involving slavery.
They say he was good to his slaves for one reason. The old dollar sign. That way he get more for them, you see, and get more out of them on his plantations. Well, that's half truth, too. I mean, he was good to his slaves. But he was also good to them because he was a humanitarian.
On a large plantation such as Forrest ran, about the only records you get are things that deal with how much food was issued or what kind of work is expected. And the sorts of things that deal with person-to-person relationships are very hard to come by. The one thing that I can tell you from historically valid point is that at the beginning of the war, when Forrest raised his own regiment, he recruited 42 of his own slaves and said, "Drive wagons for me, drive ambulances for me. At the end of the war, if the Union wins, you'll be free. If the Confederacy wins, I will set you free." During the course of the war, one deserted, the other 41 were with Forrest at the end of the war. I suppose that tells you something about the force of his personality. It does not necessarily directly answer your question, but it certainly tells you that he was a man that was able to win the allegiance of people.
I said to 45 colored fellows on my plantation that they would go with me. If we got whipped, they would be free anyhow. And if we succeeded, they would act faithfully with me to the end of the war. I would set them free. 18 months before the war closed, I was satisfied that we were going to be defeated. And I gave those 45 of them their free papers for fear I might be called. General Nathan Bedford Forrest, 1865.
After the war, 20 of the 45 former slaves went home with Forrest, including his longtime valet, Jerry, whom the other body servants nicknamed the General, seeing that he was in charge of them all. Another body servant who served in Forrest's army was Wright Whitlow from Kentucky. Wright was by Forrest's side when he attacked Fort Pillow on April 12, 1864.
I witnessed the Battle of Fort Pillow, and at one time during the battle, I held the horse of General Forrest while he mounted a new one after the first one was shot out from under him. Wright Whitlow, bodyguard, General Forrest, Confederate Cavalry.
One of the most famous accounts of a close master-body-servant relationship was that of Andrew Martin Chandler and his servant, Silas. At 15, Chandler joined the Confederate service and was put in Company F of the 44th Mississippi Infantry. His 17-year-old former slave accompanied him. Silas Chandler received his manumission before the war began, yet he chose to stay with his friend and follow him off to war.
My name is Bobby Chandler. I'm the great-grandson of Silas Chandler from West Point, Mississippi, which is my home. Silas Chandler lived in West Point as a slave belonging to the Chandler family. Silas was a slave of Andrew Chandler's father. Andrew Chandler and Silas grew up to be very good friends. Andrew went to the Civil War, and Silas went with them, probably as a body soldier. But to my understanding, he fought with him side by side, which was something unusual for slaves in the Civil War.
That kind of devotion, duty, loyalty, whatever you call it, was hardly narrow. I mean, what many people fail to realize is that before the Civil War, there were over 500,000 free blacks scattered throughout the South, 60,000 of them in the state of Virginia alone. And many of these people their roots go back generations and generations, and there were strong ties there. That human beings, being what we are, these complicated species, you could not rupture those relationships simply because of the differences in color.
There is evidence that blacks fought for their masters in their mode as body servants. But again, that's very distinct from being officially recognized as soldiers, as being armed as soldiers. Grabbing a weapon, whether it's a rifle or a knife or a shovel when the enemy is advancing directly on you, is a different thing from being issued a weapon, issued ammunition, and being given orders to fight as an integrated combat unit. In that sense, blacks did not fight for the Confederacy.
They were a very elite group in the South. This is something that their status, and this is what they were trained to do, this was their identity. And to go to something unknown for some promise that may not be a promise at all, instead of what they knew, and they had a life that was very good for them, a life that was very good, especially compared with other people who were enslaved. I think it is a very, very natural thing for people who were that close to the masters to stay with them.
So-called body servants that went off with their masters to war were slaves who accompanied a slave owner to the battle, and they would serve as cook and valet and this kind of thing. But that's another myth, because most Confederate soldiers did not own slaves. They estimate that 9 out of 10 men that fought in the Confederate Army never owned a slave. So it was only the upper class and the few that had the affluence to bring a body servant with him to the war. Many of the blacks that served with Confederate armies were there because they were recruited to be wagon drivers or cooks or whatever, not because they came off with a master.
Silas saved Andrew's life. Andrew got wounded in the Battle of Chickamauga, I think it's called, in Georgia. And they wanted to take Andrew's leg. Silas didn't want them to amputate his leg, so he stole him away from the camp and took him back home to Mississippi by hitching a freight train and hiking on a freight train with him. I had a picture which was printed in the West Point Daily paper years ago, and it was a picture of Silas and Andrew Chandler sitting side by side. We had a Black History Week here in Washington, and I used that picture in the company newsletter. And a writer for the Washington Times picked a copy up and looked at it and decided he would do a story. He did a story in the Washington Times, and then the story went about different places. And there was also a gentleman printed a magazine called the Southern Passion magazine, and he asked could he put the picture in his magazine. He put the picture in his magazine, and Andrew Chandler Battle, which is his grandson of Andrew Chandler, my grandfather's slave owner. He wrote me a letter and said that he was very surprised to see that picture, and he was familiar with that picture being in his family. And he wanted to know more about me, and he said that Andrew Chandler was his grandfather. We started corresponding with each other, and after that picture was put in the Washington Times, the Daughters of the American DAR, it's called the Daughters of American Revolution, invited me over to speak at one of their meetings. I went over to speak at one of their meetings, and they were so enthused with my story that Sally Whittington decided that she would pursue it and see if she could get documentations on the things that I had said. She did, and she found more and more. So she decided that she would ask the DAR to go to Mississippi and give the award that's given to Civil War soldiers. This award is called the Iron Cross. It's an award that's given to all Confederate soldiers. The DAR was very instrumental in getting this done in West Point, Mississippi, and a ceremony was given with a 21-gun salute.
We are the last of the old bodyguards of our masters served through the war between the states. And we have been to all the reunions, and they have treated us just the same as any other soldier.
I was raised by one of the greatest men in the world. There was never one born of a woman greater than Robert E. Lee. According to my judgment, all of his service was set free 10 years before the war, but all remained on the plantation until after the surrender. Reverend William McLee, 1918.
William McLee, born on June 12, 1835, was raised at Robert E. Lee's home, Arlington Heights. He served Mas Robert, as William called him, even after Lee gave him his free papers. When Robert E. Lee agreed to take command of the Confederate Army, William went along as his cook and servant. He boasted to cook for every major general in the Confederacy during the entire campaign of the Civil War. William was at every major battle, from the great victory at First Manassas to the crippled defeat at Gettysburg. He then accompanied General Lee to the South surrender at Appomattox. William shared his former master's many joys along with equal sorrows. He was the only eyewitness to Lee's somber meeting with Jeb Stuart at Gettysburg. But it was the death of General Thomas Stonewall Jackson when William saw General Lee cry for the first time.
I'd never seen him sadder than that gloomy morning when he told me General Stonewall Jackson had been shot by his own men. William says to me, "I've lost my right arm. I'm bleeding at the heart." William McLee.
Why do these men support the forces defending slavery? It seems today that the complexity of African American life in the Confederate and pre-Confederate South has been lost in the singular issue of slavery. But, in fact, slavery, while certainly dominated by the white race, was not their sole domain. Native Americans and African American freedmen also owned slaves. In the year preceding the war, in the city of Charleston, South Carolina alone, there existed no less than 120 black freedmen who owned at least one slave. Several black slave owners wrote jointly to the New Orleans Daily Delta in December 1860.
many places throughout the Deep South, the older parts where the larger plantations existed, also witnessed the existence of blacks owning other blacks. A number of blacks who had been manumitted or had earned enough money to purchase their own freedom became entrepreneurs, purchased or acquired land, and in turn became slave owners and went into cotton, indigo, or rice farming.
I think the most significant thing is that there were blacks who had slaves, who, in fact, I have read documents that the first incidence of slavery in Virginia was a black slave owner. And this person, in fact, there's a book called Mine Own Ground in the library that you can read about his case. He had come over as an indentured servant, so one of the earlier indentured servants, had worked his time as indentured carried and was given some land. So he needed help, so he went and got him 5 blacks to work the land with him. And after a few years, one of them, there was a neighbor visiting, and a white neighbor visiting, and he said, you know, I think I have done my time on this as an indentured servant, that I should be able to get able to leave this and go out and do my own thing. And so the guy asked him to give the details. He did, and he said, you're right. He said, come on next door and work for me. So he left, and he went over to work with his neighbor, and his owner then went to court. And being a respected man in his area and everything, the court ruled that this guy was his property for life. And that was the first incidence of slavery, because everybody else had been an indentured servant in Virginia.
Black slaveholders in the 1800s. Yes, they have been black slaveholders, and again, the term black, you know, all people of color don't really see themselves as black. I doubt that there's any institution or any practice done by non-blacks that has not been done by blacks. Especially the unique state of Louisiana, specifically New Orleans. A lot has come out in the post-60s about the blacks in the Confederacy, the black slave owners. Even in the state, if you look at the state of Louisiana today, the inner urban New Orleans folks and the, let's say, prior to 1950, and the ones living in the rest of the state, they're two different states. It's almost like a black living in Brooklyn, New York, and a black living in Utica, New York. Because of the history of New Orleans and the mixing, I mean, you know, again, if you're familiar with the Frank Yerby's writing, Dahomian, we maybe have to redefine what is black. I'm not talking about the mental state, but the physical state. We have blacks that come in all shades. In fact, 1993, they had a convention here at Caesar's Palace by black elected state officials. I knew clearly who came from New Orleans. Okay, so when we look back historically, a lot of us didn't have a consciousness of kind. Similar to today, some of us don't even say we come from Africa, huh? So, you know, when you look back and try to apply, if you use a man's color, you come up with a lot of contradictory things. Again, to many people, the racial thing here is not race, it's class. And of course, we have blacks that have been affluent. We have black slave owners. Beautiful series last year, The African in America, is talked about Adventure Smith, right? Who was an ex-slave himself who ended up owning slaves. But it's not necessarily the institution that we're talking about, what goes on in that institution, okay? He needed workers. And of course, and if you're an entrepreneur and a businessman, huh, you do a lot of things that might appear to be contradictory, huh? I mean, after all, we fought, this is the land of the free. And its bedrock was what? Slavery. So I don't say that looking back in the past that we can exclude blacks from anything, but it was not a typical type thing. It was a unique situation. If I'm not mistaken, only 4% of people owned slaves, and a minute percentage of them were slaves. I mean, blacks owning slaves.
The 6th Louisiana Cavalry had at least 9 blacks in its ranks, and probably many more. There were mulattoes who lived as whites in almost all respects. The free black residents had a large, vibrant subculture with a long history of military service to their colony and state. Blacks have been a part of the Louisiana militia since the 1720s that fought against pirates in 1727. And later, both slaves and free blacks helped the French against the Choctaw Indians in other battles. When the Spanish took over New Orleans in the 1760s, they continued to depend upon the black militia. There were 2 companies of blacks who served under Andrew Jackson in the Battle of New Orleans. This battle would prove instrumental in the formation of the New Orleans Native Guard in 1861.
This may be the first military situation these people have ever been in, huh? And right or wrong, we have a tendency to believe what people tell us, huh? You're not going to say, yeah, I want you to go shoot at the guys in the blue uniforms because they're here to free you. No, right? We say, boy, carry my bags, huh? Just like we do in golf, huh? Well, you carry my bags. Now, if they shoot at me, I want you to shoot after them. First of all, to say that they clearly understood the situation they found themselves, we might be in total error. After the fact, he had a gray uniform on, we could pat him on the back or condemn him, huh? The guy says, I was just following orders. Similar to Nuremberg trial, huh? I was following orders from the boss. I saw nothing wrong for somebody shooting at me. In fact, that's what we do, like in Vietnam, we're trying to convince kids, if a guy shoots at you, he gotta be bad, huh? The fact that you invade his home, that don't count, huh? And guess what? The North invaded the South most of the time. So it's easy to say, we're getting a group of boys together to defend our territory. Ain't that right, y'all slaves? Yes, sir.
When the war began, blacks entered Confederate service primarily as the servants of their white masters. Although in Louisiana there were a number that entered, these were known as free men of color, they were free blacks, and in Louisiana an entire company was organized into Confederate service. As the war progressed, however, the need for body service diminished. Much of the luggage was sent back home, and the need for soldiers on the front line carrying a musket increased, especially as the war progressed and the prisoner exchange was stopped. So the black soldiers were more valuable as a fighting man, so they were put into integrated units, not regimented together as an all-black unit as the Union Army was, but they were integrated throughout the southern units and served that way.
Was an old unit that goes back a long time. There was always a very large free population of blacks in the city of New Orleans, and during the time before the Civil War, to be a member of the Native Guard, not only were you a free black, but you had to have an annual income of a little bit more than $25,000 a year, and this was in 1860. Now, Andrew Jackson made it very public that he was very appreciative of the heroism of the black soldiers who fought in the Native Guard units, along with other blacks that fought in other units as well. And he was convinced that the Battle of New Orleans was in part won by these heroic blacks, who once again, as they did during the Revolutionary War, was demonstrating their patriotism.
The slaves themselves would have found little comfort in the Union's attitude toward slavery. One of their greatest generals, General Ulysses S. Grant, not only owned slaves, but had been employed by his father-in-law as a slave driver. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln, while campaigning in Charleston, Illinois, made this speech.
I will say then that I am not, nor have ever been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor have ever been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with the white people. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to that of the white race.
People have this picture as if the North were a free area and the South was not. The Confederate States of America was a legitimate attempt at self-determination. Our founding fathers had introduced it in the Declaration of Independence that a people had a right to decide their own destiny. And Southerners viewed the, quote, Civil War as the second war of independence.
The radical Republicans had a big impact in terms of Union policy, whether or not to arm Afro-Americans and let them fight for the Union Army, whether or not to emancipate the slaves. Lincoln had his own vision of what he wanted to do, which included, among other things, gradually emancipating the slaves, possibly compensating owners for their slave property, and also moving slaves out, recolonizing them elsewhere out of the country, Haiti or Liberia. But there's a difference of opinion between the radical Republicans and Lincoln. They were obviously more radical than he was.
It was years before that it was clearly stated that the war was over slavery. Look at Lincoln himself. He says what? The Emancipation Proclamation. It only freed the slaves, ironically, in the rebelling states. So the states that weren't rebelling, they were still slaves. Now, of course, Fred Douglass and the boys got on him. But again, we're talking about people illiterate. Again, if you not near the big house, you might, I know the Underground Railroad and how we get things, messages around, but some people didn't know what was going on,
On the first day of January, A.D. 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people therein shall be then in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforth, and forever free.
The Union Army did not have a great deal of respect for the black soldiers.
Many of the northern armies did not feel they were fighting to free slaves, but to preserve the Union. So North and South, it's not a simple question.
My first duty will be to clear the army of surplus Negroes, mules, and horses. General William Tecumseh Sherman.
In all my movements, my corps commanders put little or no reliance upon the efficiency of Negro troops. There was a stupid, unreasoning, and quite vengeful prejudice toward them. General Benjamin F. Butler, Union Army.
Compare with this what the Confederate forces said about their black soldiers.
I believe that with proper regulations, they may be made efficient soldiers. General Robert E. Lee, Army of Northern Virginia.
The necessity for more fighting men is upon us. We can only get a sufficiency by making the Negro share the danger and hardship of the war. If we arm him and train and make him fight for the country, every considered principle and policy demands that we shall set him and his whole race who side with us free. Give him, as an earnest of our intentions, such immediate immunities as will impress him with sincerity, and be in keeping with his condition, enroll a portion of his class as soldiers of the Confederacy, and we change the race from a dread menace to a position of strength.
Confederate General Patrick Claiborne.
Those black Southerners among us during the war behaved in such a manner that I shall always respect them for it. And those boys stayed with me, drove my teams, and better Confederates did not live. General Nathan Bedford Forrest, retired Confederate cavalry.
Can't you send me a force of Negroes with axes? I can make good soldiers of Negroes. Brigadier General Randall Lee Gibson.
They didn't know freedom, and perhaps if they did, as a cartoon in a northern newspaper showed a charge of the 1st Confederate Black Unit, and they're all charging, putting their guns away because they're free. But these men didn't know that. These men felt loyalty, and because essentially what you do is you're fighting for your group, you're fighting for that unit. They felt they were part of the unit. And that's reasonable. Stonewall Jackson's cook, who was a black man, there's a picture of him as an elderly man. He attended every reunion he could of the Stonewall Brigade, and he is festooned with all his ribbons and medals. He was as much a part of that command as any soldier, and accepted as such.
We all would do well to learn about blacks and the Confederacy. It's important to know that they didn't fight for the Confederacy in terms of being armed soldiers. That's one thing that Jefferson Davis simply would not allow, although many of his generals wanted to enlist blacks in the Army. We need to understand that blacks were laborers for the Confederacy, much like they were laborers for their plantation masters outside of the war context. In that sense, they were coerced as supporters of the Confederacy, working in factories, working as nurses, working as armaments people. They were coerced just like they were coerced in slavery. And there's nothing to be ashamed of, because to be ashamed of that is to blame the victim. What we need to do is to understand this history, contextualize it, put it in its place, and then move on from there.
In what state did you reside when you served as a servant or of a soldier or a sailor in the service of the Confederate States?
Mississippi.
When did you serve in that capacity?
At the siege of Vicksburg.
And how long did you serve?
Until the surrender of Vicksburg.
What was the name of the party whom you served?
Captain Moffett.
What was the name or designation of the company and regiment or vessel in which your owner served?
Louisiana Regiment.
Were you ever wounded while in actual service?
Yes.
Give date on which you received your wound.
June the 22nd or the 23rd.
At what place were you wounded?
On Grove Street in Vicksburg.
What is the nature of your wound?
My right arm shot off.
Have you lost one foot or one hand?
One hand.
My grandfather went to war at age 14, along with his master's two sons, E.R. and Sidney Olam. They saw action in Shiloh, Lookout Mountain, Bryce Crossroad, and Vicksburg. All three lived through it. They grew up as boys together, so when it was time to go to war, they went together. It was a most hideous war. I've been told after a 4-hour period at Lookout Mountain that there were more casualties than the United States Armed Forces suffered in World Wars I and II combined, and they all were Americans.
In the year 2001, the fact that South Carolina's legislature still flew the rebel flag caused a great stir among liberals, black and white, not because it was the flag of the losing side, but because it was called the symbol of racism and slavery.
This is part of our shared history. It's not a matter of me being proud. I'm proud of that history. The Confederate flag per se doesn't offend me. It stands for what the person holding it wants it to. If I see it at a KKK rally, I know it's a hate flag. If I see it at a Confederate veterans organization, it's a patriotic flag. If I see it on the back of a pickup truck, it's being trivialized. If you want to honor your ancestors, you have to honor them regardless. You can't insult me with my own heritage.
I think today many black people, when it comes specifically to the Confederacy, what they have been led to believe is that a plantation was a concentration camp, meaning that a Confederate flag was a swastika, meaning that slavery was the American Holocaust. Once you start making those comparisons, which are unfair, then you wind up putting yourself in a situation where the average black person, whether they are a student or a scholar, loses all capacities to read into the past with objectivity. And so they come there with all this extra modern day baggage and they don't see it as it is.
I would sum it up that it was a war of this nation that affected both blacks, whites. There was pain in every family. And when you do not realize that blacks fought for the Confederacy, then you do not use the Civil War correctly. They have their place of honor. They should be honored as soldiers. And when you destroy monuments, when you fight against the Confederate flag, these are things you are actually destroying part of the black history. They fought under those flags.
And I think this brings us to the question, really, of why do men fight, or now women? Do you fight for ideology? I don't think so. Do you fight for hearth and kin? Yeah, somewhat. But what I think really is the unit cohesion
is you fight essentially with each other. The slaves that fought with Forrest simply were slaves. That's all they knew. They didn't know freedom.
If black Confederates are shunned by modern-day Afro-Americans for their participation on the Confederate side in the Civil War, it's actually not very difficult to understand why. Much like the question of slavery itself, which until recently blacks weren't really willing to embrace. It's an embarrassing kind of history, and people need to understand the situation that these slaves were in, their options. We don't have any idea of what slavery was like. Nobody around today in the United States has an idea of what it was like to live under slavery. We just don't know. We can only speculate and we can only guess. So it's unfair to make judgments about those people based on the fact that they were enslaved.
Sadly, the greatest battle for the black Confederates has never ended. It continues to this day. The fight to be heard and known has always been their most difficult struggle. For there is nothing about them in most history books, nor any mention of their existence in schools. But they were there, from the first moments of the war to its absolute end. Long before the Union implemented the use of black troops, African Americans in the Confederacy stood courageously and loyal within the ranks and never gave up their beliefs to defend the South.